I've you described the 24 months and beyond after this first hour we've been talking about. So what happens to Earth? What happens to humans if a full-on nuclear war happens?
So for that, I was super privileged to talk to Professor Brian Toon, who is one of the original 5 authors of the nuclear winter theory. And that theory was published in the early 1980s. One of Professor Toon's professors was Carl Sagan, who is sort of the most famous author of the nuclear winter theory. And, there were all kinds of controversies about it when it came out, including the Defense Department saying it was Soviet propaganda, which it wasn't. And what the nuclear winter authors conceded back in the 80s was that their modeling was just the best it could be based on what they had at the time. And so now flash forward to where we are in 2024 and talking to Professor Toon, who's been working on this issue for all these decades since. He shared with me how the climate models today, with the systems we have, the computer systems, reveal that actually nuclear winter is worse, right? So to answer your questions, the bombs stop falling. In my scenario, 72 minutes after they first launch. The bombs stop falling. And then the mega fires begin. Each nuclear weapon will have, according to the Defense Department, a mega fire that will burn between 100 and 300 square miles. So 1,000 weapons, 1,500 weapons. Think about those mega fires. Everything is burning. Forests, cities. Think about the pyrotoxins in all the cities, high rises burning. And all of this soot gets lofted into the air. According to Toon, some 300 billion pounds of soot. And what happens? It blocks out the sun. And without sun, we have nuclear winter. We have a situation whereby ice sheets form. You're talking about bodies of water in places like Iowa being frozen for 10 years.
So temperature drops.
Temperature plummets, right? And there are all kinds of papers that have been written about this using modern systems. And the numbers vary, but the bottom line is agriculture fails.
Foods obviously dies. So the agriculture system completely shuts down. So the food sources shut down. So there's no food. There's no sun. Temperature drops completely. No electricity.
And we haven't even spoken of radiation poisoning because, the radiation poisoning kills many people in the aftermath of the nuclear exchange. But after the nuclear freeze ends, after nuclear winter, after the sun starts to come back, let's say 8, 9, 10 years, now you have no ozone layer, or you have a severely depleted ozone layer. And so the sun's rays are now poisonous. So you have people living underground. And you have this great thawing. And with that great thawing comes pathogens and plague. And you have this, system where the small-bodied animals, the insects and whatnot, begin reproducing really fast. And the larger body animals like you and me begin to go extinct. Professor Toon said it to me this way. He said, 66 million years ago, an asteroid hit Earth, killed all the dinosaurs, and wiped out 70% of the species. And nuclear war would likely do the same. And so here we are talking about this because there is a difference. There's nothing you can do about an asteroid, but there is something you can do about a nuclear war.
Do you think it's possible that some humans will survive all of this? So if we look, how long would it be? Would it be decades? Would it be centuries before the Earth starts to have the capacity to grow food again?
Carl Sagan talked about that in this amazing book that he wrote with 2 scientist colleagues called The Cold and the Dark. and they have there's a bunch of essays about exactly this, right? Like what would happen and how long would it take? It's really interesting. It's dated, it's from the 80s, but man, is it shocking. And you think about that where okay, so men return to sort of the worst, most base versions of themselves. Civilization is gone, right? Meaning, civil society. There's no rule of law. It's just fend for yourself. There's, people fighting over what little resources there are. Man returns to a hunter-gatherer state. And to really think about this idea, I looked at the oldest known archaeological site in the world in Turkey, which is called Göbekli Tepe. And it's really fascinating to me because I interviewed one of the two archaeologists who first found this site in the early 90s. And the lead archaeologist was a guy named Klaus Schmidt, and Michael Morsch was the young graduate student who was with him. And Morsch's description of like coming upon this like rumored to be site. There was something called a wishing tree on the site, which I just found so human and perfect, that it was this magical place and it was locatable because there was a wishing tree on a hill and it's where people went to wish and to hope that their wishes came true. I mean, how human is that, right? And that is where beneath the wishing tree, kind of like in the shadow of the wishing tree, there was a tep, which is a hill. And beneath that, there is the oldest known civilization in the world. 12,000 years ago, a group of hunter-gatherers built this site. Why, we don't know. But I imagined when through Morse's descriptions of coming upon, like, he tripped on a rock, he told me, right? He tripped over a stone that turned out to be the top part of a 12,000-year-old sculpted man, giant pillar, right? And he talked about coming upon that. And then no one knows really what Göbekli Tepe was for. And that makes my mind try and answer the question you asked me internally, right? Just as like a human who's here on Earth for the amount of time I'm here. Like, if there were a nuclear war, what would it be like? What would it be like when someone in the future, would we become archaeologists one day? Would civilization rebuild? Would we develop computers? Who knows? It's interesting to think about. I hope we never have to.
What would we remember about this time?
Right.
It is terrifying to think that most of it will be forgotten. Everything we kind of assume will not be forgotten. We think maybe some of the technological developments will be forgotten, but we assume like some of history won't be forgotten. But realistically, especially us descending into primitive survival, probably everything since the industrial age will be forgotten. Like everything. Maybe some religious ideas will persist. Some stories and myths will persist. But like all the wisdom we've gathered, higher level sort of technological wisdom would be gone. Like that's terrifying to think about. And like maybe even as you touch on, the very fact of nuclear war might be forgotten. Like the lessons of nuclear war might be forgotten. That there are these weapons, sort of the obvious elephant in the room would be one of the things that's completely forgotten or becomes so vague in the recollection of humans that our understanding will change. It's almost as if a god descended on Earth and destroyed everything. Maybe that's how it will persist. Sort of like mythological interpretation of what nuclear weapons are. That's terrifying because then it could repeat again.
Mm-hmm. But I think for me, the idea of what is buried becomes very interesting and very human and in a strange way optimistic and positive, because if you can visualize that wishing tree, and I have a picture of it in the book from one of the archaeologists who work on that, right? You think, what were they wishing for, right? And then you think of your own self, what do I wish for in this world, right? Because I do think all things come from what happens metaphorically around the dinner table, right? Like what people put their eyes on becomes interesting and expands what people talk about. And ultimately, when you think about the long arc of time in human civilization, it does kind of make you want to communicate more with your enemies, with your adversaries. And, I think about the quote, what Einstein is said to have said, which is that he was asked what weapons World War III would be fought with. And he said, I don't know, but I know that
सबैजना फेरि मैदानको गाली र हिँडिरहेको हामी सिंहको खाडी र खासमा बन्नु पर्दा मुजी काटिन्छु कानी र ब्याक मुर्चाको ख्याते मुजी भो त्यहाँबाट ल्याएको खानेपानी हेर्दा बिर्को छैन है खै बिर्को